Today's date is May 20th, 1997. We're in Denver, Colorado, representing Abilene Christian University History Department, 12th Armored Division History Project. My name is Jake Fortenberry, and I'm going to be interviewing Thomas Brassell.
That is correct.
Okay, sir. Just start off a little bit. Where were you born? Where'd you grow up at?
I was born in Evergreen, Alabama, and I lived there until about 1940 when I was called into the service with the National Guard.
Growing up and such, what was your family background? What did your mom and
Farming.
dad do? Farming. So you grew up, did y'all have tractors? Was it horse or?
It was all muscle power, either human or mules.
And you said that you were, farming. Did the Dust Bowl affect y'all very much?
No,
growing up?
not the Dust Bowl didn't affect Alabama, but the Depression did. And many of the farmers lost their farms, including my father, and we had to move into town around 1930.
What did your dad end up doing when he quit farming?
He was working as a night watchman at a lumber mill when he died.
And you mentioned that you were in the National Guard. You got drafted?
No, you joined the National Guard, and the National Guard was called into service in 1940, I believe, the fall of 1940. And I stayed in the National Guard at Camp Blanding, Florida, where we trained with the 31st Infantry Division. And we were called in for a year, and the year was up in October of '41, and they extended our service from that time to October, and then of course Pearl Harbor occurred in 1941, and then everybody was in it.
What did you do in the National Guard? You were just infantry?
No, I was field artillery.
Red leg. So did you finished high school or college? Or
I finished high school. Times were very hard back in those days. The Depression occurred in the early 30s, but then in the latter part of the 30s, we almost relapsed back into another depression, and small town jobs were very hard to find, and usually the only people that had jobs were those that had a store there or something of that nature, and so many of the farmers had lost all of their farms, that labor was very cheap, and about the only job you could get at that time was common labor, if you didn't have an education or something of that nature to help you.
You mentioned with the National Guard that you were stationed down in Florida. What do you remember about the differences in between Florida and home, weather-wise, and just the barracks? And
well, Florida was almost like a different world. You seldom got very cold weather down there, although occasionally it did get cold, but you got into the area where you had the citrus groves and trees, and as I recall, there was more Spanish moss down there than in Alabama, and the climate was somewhat more temperate.
You mentioned Pearl Harbor. Were you were still extended in the National Guard when that happened?
Yes.
What do you remember about that, what you felt and where you were when all that went down?
Well, we had just gotten back to Camp Blanding, Florida, when we got word that we should go to Tampa, Florida on the 8th to celebrate the opening of a new armory. And we were preparing to go down to Tampa, and we were in the tents just lying around on a Sunday afternoon, and I think there was some program where they had the Warsaw Concerto on. There was another popular name for the song, now I've forgotten it, but they broke in on that song and announced that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, at that time we knew that war was somewhat imminent, but we thought it was just another case of the news people getting everything mixed up, because they couldn't bomb Pearl Harbor. They must have bombed the Philippines. So we listened, and sure enough, they kept repeating the news over the radio, and finally we realized that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. But when something like that happens, it seems like everybody gets stunned, and nobody takes any action to begin with. So the trip to Tampa, Florida, which was more or less a festival as far as the Army was concerned, the dedication of a new armory building down there, we headed out for Tampa, Florida, and we left Camp Blanding, Florida in the morning, and there were people out along the roadside cheering us as we passed by. We were headed in the right direction. We were headed to the west from Camp Blanding. Camp Blanding was over near Jacksonville, Florida, but we were all cheered by the people along the roadside. And when we got to Tampa, somebody woke up to the fact that a war was going on, so we turned right around and went back to Camp Blanding, Florida. And while we were there at Camp Blanding, somebody got the idea that perhaps maybe Camp Blanding was vulnerable to attack. The Germans, I think, had moved in with their submarines and were attacking the ships off the east coast at Jacksonville. And we moved all of our trucks and equipment out of the camp and into the scrub woods down there. And we were with the 43rd Division, Infantry Division, and they were called out to go to another camp immediately, and they couldn't find all of the vehicles that they had hidden. And we were finding 6x6 trucks several months after they had moved, where they had hidden them in the woods. So it was just one of the little things that happened that now seem humorous. At the time it was quite serious, of course. We were called out once on a submarine scare in the middle of the night to go to Jacksonville, Florida. There was reports that a submarine had entered the St. Johns River and was coming up the river. And we had some old French 75s, model of 1897s, and I don't know what would have happened if there had been a submarine. I'm just glad a barge or something didn't wander in the way of us while we were out there. We could have hit somebody.
Being in the National Guard, y'all had to go through the same type of basic that everybody else went through, correct?
Well, you went through the National Guard was semi-trained when it was called into service. And the training was more or less along the lines of World War I. And things were changing so fast. The method of conducting warfare had changed quite a bit, and you were unlearning some things and learning other things, and we were still training with World War I ordnance. We had the model of 1897 French 75, and the only difference between that and the one that was used in World War I was the fact that they had modified it and put rubber wheels on it, and with the rubber wheels they could be towed behind trucks rather than by horses.
You're talking about your artillery piece. How many millimeters?
75.
Just 75 millimeter. What was like the range on a weapon like that, and how far could y'all get out?
Oh, roughly about 7 or 8 miles.
How many rounds a minute could y'all fire, or do you remember?
Oh, a good crew could fire 15, 20 rounds a minute if they would limit the length of time they were firing. The gun would get too hot if you fired too fast. But the French 75 was one of the better artillery pieces that was developed around 1900, and it had a long recoil with like a shock absorber on an automobile. And when the gun was fired, the tube of the barrel would recoil backwards about 3 feet, and that would absorb the shock so that you didn't shake everybody off the gun and spoil aim for the next shot. But it would go back, and the idea was to open the breech when it was at the end of the recoil, and as it was going back into the battery again, going forward, to load it and have it ready to fire. It was almost like it was an automatic mechanism firing it. A good crew could do that.
You said a good crew. How many people were on a crew to operate that?
Oh, I think there were about 6 or 7, something like that. I think, well, it was the chief of section, who usually was a sergeant. The person who did the aiming for direction was a gunner corporal, and the person who raised and lowered the barrel was the number 1 cannoneer. He would the one that would normally set the range for the distance. And then you had a loader that was number 2, and 3 and 4 were to prepare the ammunition and get it ready. And I think there were, in most cases, there was a 5th cannoneer. I've forgotten exactly what his job was.
When did you, or where did you go from down there in Florida?
From Florida, we went to Fort Bliss, Texas. Not Bliss, but Bowie, Camp Bowie, I believe it was. That was over near Brownwood, Texas. There are a number of camps over in that part of western Texas at the time. And we happened to go to Camp Bowie. And from Camp Bowie, I went to Officers Training School at Fort Sill. Officers Candidate School is what it should be called. And I went into class, the OCS class 24. The Officers Candidate School was taking in about 500 students, and this was just for artillery, 500 students a week. And things were rough back in those days in that the individual didn't count as much as you would think one should. It was somewhat harsh the way they called out the candidates, and their goal was to get approximately 50% of the class graduate, and the other 50% would go on somewhere else. And you never knew whether you were getting a fair shake or not. There were tactical officers running around taking notes. You were marching everywhere, and you were doing this and doing that. And of course, you had the academic standards to meet, gunnery, and also the presence of command. You had your chance to, we had sections of about 20 people in each section, 20, 24 people. And each day one of the candidates would march the section, and we marched everywhere we went by section. And there were people out taking notes about how well you gave command and how well you handled the troops. And some people just naturally were too timid or too shy to fit the mold of an officer. I had some trouble with that when I was an enlisted man. I naturally was timid or shy, but I soon found out that if you holler loud enough and make enough noise, you can get things done. It didn't make a whole lot of difference whether you knew what you were doing or not, so long as you looked like you knew what you were doing. But, oh, that's not exactly true, but you wanted somebody out there that when they said something, when they were training for officers, you wanted somebody out there that when an order was given, of course everybody was trained to obey orders, but you had to reinforce that with your personality. And if you didn't have that ability, then that counted against you when you were officers training school.
You said you were enlisted before you went to OCS. What rank were you before you went to OCS?
I was a sergeant.
You were a sergeant. And what was, you said Fort Sill, I assume that's Fort Sill,
Fort
Oklahoma?
Sill, Oklahoma, yes.
And what were the differences there in between, like, Florida and Oklahoma?
Well, it was another world. And as I recall, in Oklahoma, you could look in one direction, it would be snowing, another direction it would be sleeting, another direction it was raining, and the sun was shining somewhere off in the distance. And the weather was quite variable, and it wasn't the most pleasant place to stay. The wintertime, it was not the best of places to be. In the summertime, it did get awfully hot.
How long was OCS?
It was 3 months. We went to a 1 month preparatory school to OCS before we went to OCS. Altogether it was 4 months training, but nominally you had to take a person and in 3 months make an officer out of him. And that's a pretty tall order.
Do you remember any particular instructors or friends or buddies from any of that time through Florida or through down at Brownwood or up there at Seal? Anybody in particular or anything that sticks out in your mind from any of that training?
Oh, there are a number of things. We were back in Florida before I went to OCS. The field artillery carried pistols, 45 automatic pistols, as their personal weapon. The infantry, of course, carried rifles, and in those days the M1 rifle was just beginning to come online, and most of the infantry units had the Springfield rifle, which was a very good rifle, bolt-action rifle. And the government had millions, literally millions, of the Enfield rifle, which was built on the British model. They built during World War I. They built a number for the British Army, and they had some for the American Army, but when they reduced the size of the Army, they used only the Springfields, but they had all of the other old rifles in storage. And when they started expanding the Army, there just were not enough 45 pistols. So they took the pistols away from us and gave us these old Enfield rifles, which were built on the British design, and I think they built the rifles primarily to use a bayonet with them because they were so long and they were an awkward thing, and everybody cursed the idea that we had to have these awkward things when we had a nice fancy pistol. And after that time, only in the field artillery at least, only majors or above got to wear pistols. But story was they issued those to us on a Friday, and they had to be, Saturday is always inspection day. When they issued those to us, they came the same way they came out of the box from ordnance, filled with a heavy grease called cosmoline, and that was to keep them from corroding. And we had, on Friday, we had to clean all of those weapons with, and get them ready for inspection. The manual called for use of mineral spirits. Well, at that time, things were in short supply, and gasoline was always used to clean. And we cleaned them, and everybody but the cooks got theirs cleaned, and they came in around 8 or 9 o'clock after everything was cleaned up in the kitchen. They had a tent next door to us, and they cleaned the weapons. I guess they got them clean, but they got all the cosmoline off of them, and they were tired, and they had a 2-gallon bucket with about a half gallon of gasoline in the bottom of it, and they left it over in the corner of the tent. And one of the cooks got up early the next morning to start getting breakfast ready, and he lit a cigarette when he got up, and he threw the match over into the can of gasoline, and the gasoline caught on fire, and he initially ran out of the door of the tent and decided he'd better get the gasoline out of there, and he went back in and got the bucket of gasoline. No, he didn't. He started back in to get the bucket of gasoline when one of the people that was sleeping in there, Huey Nobles, took the can of gas to throw out the door, and just as he threw it out the door, the other guy opened the door on him. And Huey was covered with gasoline, and he was running down the street, just a flaming torch. And I was sleeping in the tent next door, and I had awakened and knew what was going on. And I picked up a comforter from the bed. It was a GI comforter, and I went out, and a guy next door tackled Huey, and I got the blanket and wrapped it around him, and I presume it saved him from much more serious burns. I never saw him after that. He went somewhere else. But in doing so, I got the blanket, a few holes burned in it. And so many people were smoking and were burning holes in those comforters that they cracked down on it, and there was just no way to get around not paying for a comforter if you burned it. And it took about 3 months to get that squared away so that I didn't have to pay for the comforter. And I don't know how many letters. Had I known it would have been that much trouble, I would have just paid for it, but I got my backbone and decided that I wouldn't pay for it unless I absolutely had to.
When you got out of OCS up there at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where'd you go from there?
Well, at that time, the 12th Armored Division was being formed, and some of the field artillery officers from the 12th Armored Division came by Fort Sill, and they were able to pick out some of the people that they wanted. So the story goes, I'm not sure. But in OCS Class 24 supplied most of the second lieutenants that went with the 12th Armored Division. We were given orders, given a commission as a temporary lieutenant, second lieutenant. That was on August 4th, 1942. And we went to camp up in Kentucky, Camp Campbell. It was Camp Campbell then, now it's Fort Campbell. They retained the camp after the war was over. But then we got a delay en route going home, and you could go many circuitous routes to get to your home, but that was a custom at the time. Rather than giving you a leave or something, they would give you 4 or 5 days delay en route. So most of the people got the government tickets. The government furnished the tickets on railroads. In those days, everything was railroad travel. There was no, well, you had buses, but if you really wanted to go somewhere, you went by railroads. There were airplanes, but they were few and far between. But the massive movements of troops in the United States at that time was done on the railroads. And we got on a regular scheduled train at that time. And went home and then went to Camp Campbell, and we were, each had gone there individually. And in forming a division, a new division like that, you have to get the personnel from other divisions, or in this case they had a bunch of second lieutenants that just got out of OCS. But you go to another division and say there's a up-and-coming major, for instance, in one of the divisions. He would get a chance to go to the 12th Armored Division and become a lieutenant colonel. And the senior officers, first lieutenants and above, usually came from other divisions. They would bleed the divisions to get fresh soldiers to form a new division. And that's one of the things that took so much time in getting the Army ready. You just had, you had to lift yourself up by the bootstrap to do that. But anyway, they tried to mix it up. We had, I think, in our battalion, we had 2 West Pointers, a number of reserve officers, first lieutenants and above, then this whole batch of, new batch of second lieutenants. In addition to that, they took enlisted men from other units, such as the 6th Armored Division, I think, furnished quite a few of the enlisted men. And say there was a gunner corporal that showed some promise, then he would be shipped out and with the promise that if he made the grade, he'd be promoted to a sergeant. So we had a cadre of about 16 enlisted men in our battery. I was in Battery A, assigned to Battery A, 494th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. And this was typical of all of the artillery battalions. They started off with that small amount of, you might say, semi-trained men, enough to get things going. And the first order of business was to train those people that came there so that they could train the recruits that were coming in, the draftees at that time. And we spent a lot of time training the troops and being trained ourselves. Most of us had had some work in gunnery, and I was instrument corporal and had worked with the guns. So the gunnery aspect of being a second lieutenant didn't faze me at all, but there are so many other things that must be done. You've got, it seemed like you were doing more things, not in direct training for fighting than you were training for fighting, but you had to get everything organized. So we were organized and were training, and we had one rather ambitious commander of all of the field artillery, Colonel Luberman. He was a West Pointer, was a colonel, bucking to be a brigadier general, and he was a good man, but he was kind of rough, and it seemed like everybody there, the older officers, they looked askance at the new second lieutenants coming in from Fort Sill, as well they might. And the idea of Colonel Luberman was that every officer should be able to do every job and to do it better than an enlisted man. Otherwise, he wasn't fit to be an officer. And, the training was quite rough, and more ways than one. At that time, we had jeeps were not a common part of the military establishment. In the Armored Division, they had grown up from the cavalry, and the cavalry liked horses. And if you didn't have a horse, a motorcycle was the next best thing. And there were a lot of motorcycles in an Armored Division. And somehow or another, we got shipments of motorcycles in there to train on. And the colonel said every officer's going to have to learn to ride a motorcycle, and that extra training for the officers was done on the weekends. I had never ridden a motorcycle in my life. I'd ridden a bicycle, and they lined us all up out there, and there was a row of motorcycles. They had the old Harley Davidsons and the Indian motorcycles. And they said, we'll teach you, going to teach you how to ride a motorcycle today. That was Sunday. And everybody that can ride a bicycle, hold up the hands. I held my hand up. I got out there, and there was a couple of the gung-ho officers that really knew how to ride a motorcycle, and they got out there, and they showed us how to start it, how operate the gas with the handle on, with the lever on the handle and the brakes. That's about all we were showed. Also how to shift gears. And about 15 minutes after I got on that motorcycle, we were out on the highway doing 55, 60 miles an hour. And that was the start of the training. Things moved rapidly back in those days. And we went down through one of the local towns there with the motorcycles. I think there were about a dozen of us on this particular group. And we didn't know what we were doing, how to shift, and the motorcycles were making all kinds of noise. And that drew some complaints from the people who were going to church on Sunday. But they took us out, and we went 80 miles cross country on a motorcycle. We got back that night. Next morning, I was out. I was a motorcycle instructor.
That is fast-paced.
Things, well, in those days, we didn't know we couldn't do something. And we knew we had to, and there was just a different change. There was a change that came about after World War, after Pearl Harbor, and things got into high gear, generally speaking.
You mentioned going from OCS en route to Camp Campbell, that you went home en route. Did you have a good trip?
Oh yes, very good trip. And when we came into Camp Campbell, there were some people, local people there, waiting for the troops that were coming in. We were the first troops to go into Camp Campbell, first combat troops. And I remember one couple asked me if I wanted to ride out to the camp, and they took me out to the camp and invited me to come to church and that sort of thing, and the people were very hospitable. The Camp Campbell was one of the better camps in that they had wooden barracks, and everybody lived in an enclosed building. In the camps down in Florida and Texas, they had a platform of wood with a canvas tent stretched over the top of them. Of course, at Camp Campbell, it was much colder. Camp Campbell was right on the border between Kentucky and Tennessee, and it can get quite cold up there.
Some of the other things in training, did you participate in the Hellcat camps and all that when they're at Camp Campbell? Before y'all went on the Tennessee maneuvers, did you do any of that?
Oh yes, we were constantly training, and there was the Armored Division wanted to be different from the regular Army, as you know. One way they did it was to wear the caps on the left side of the head rather than the right side. And at one time, after World War I, there had been an Armored Corps, which was abolished, and then they got the Armored Force, and it was trying to establish itself as a group outside of the regular Army. They wanted to imply that you're a gung-ho type of soldier, that you were better than just ordinary when you were in armored divisions. But that went just so far. But we had to learn a lot of different things there. We had a lot of the normal training. One of the things that would have been better, after we got the cadre in there and got the cadre trained, we did get in the draftees to fill up, flesh out the division. And they came in as just raw draftees without any military training. And we had to give them the basic training to begin with. It would have been much better if it had been possible to have a camp, as they do now, where you go in and get a basic training of 3 months before you get into an organized unit. At least you can, you know how to march, and you know the ropes by that time. But we had to do all of that, and it may not have been efficient as it could have been. that method of training, but it was about the only way that it could be done. And I think the way that it was done and the way we went from a very small army that was smaller than Poland, for instance, when the war started, to the one of the larger armies on earth in a relatively short time. I think only the Russians and the Germans had a larger army than the United States at that time, during the war, that is. But we did a lot of training out on the going out. It takes a lot of training just to get accustomed to moving a division. Moving one vehicle is nothing, but when you move 1,000 of them over roads that can only take 100, it takes a bit of doing to schedule everything, and a lot of things can go wrong. I remember one time we were out at Camp Campbell, and it was a rainy season in the winter, and some of the officers that had been over to North Africa at that time came back, and they were to review the training we were undergoing. Camp Campbell, the terrain at Camp Campbell was very unusual in that there was a lot of wind-blown clay of volcanic origin in Kentucky. It came in from somewhere. A lot of the hills up there were nothing but bentonite clay, which will hold water and just it doesn't let water seep through. And you could get stuck in a mud hole up on top of a hill. And we had a lot of trouble up there with that mud, and we went out one day, and vehicles were stuck all over the place. And one place we had an M7, that was the field artillery, the weapon we used in the field artillery. It was an M7. It had a 105 millimeter howitzer on it, and built on a tank chassis. And the thing had gotten stuck so that the top of it was level with the ground. And there's a procedure in the Army when you close up a latrine or something, you put a sign there, "Old Latrine." And this M7 had gotten stuck so bad up there that they had somebody had put a sign, "Old M7." Let it go at that. But getting back to the officers that came over from North Africa, we apologized to them, said this is the worst we've seen, said we would have liked to have shown you what we could do. They says, oh no, this is excellent training. This is exactly the sort of thing you run into in combat, and that's what they had run into in North Africa, that the weather and the terrain was probably one of the biggest enemies of all. It's one of the little things, that you seldom think about, but it was good training back there. And we went on the maneuvers in Tennessee, which I thought it was a very good exercise. I had been on maneuvers before when the 10th Armored Division and some of the other divisions were maneuvering down over that same area, and I went down as an umpire, so I knew the area pretty well before we went down there. And I was just put on attached duty from the battery when that happened. But detached duty, I should have said. But we, I think, showed up fairly well during the maneuvers, and we learned a lot of things. And mostly the maneuver is the movement of the troops, and the living out under the combat conditions without being troubled by somebody shooting at you at the same time. In most cases, it was a lot of fun. I know that when we were out on maneuvers, we were there in the wintertime. We seldom had a sick man in the battalion. Everybody was healthy. We came back in after the maneuvers and moved back into the barracks. And, you had 10% of the people, 15% down with colds, respiratory diseases, whereas out in the field like that, although you were cold and freezing at times, you just weren't huddled together where you could spread respiratory diseases.
When you were out there on the Tennessee maneuvers, how long did that go on?
I don't know. It's hard to say. There's been some 50 or more years. It's my recollection is it was several months.
And then y'all came back to Camp Campbell, and how long did y'all stay there before they took you down to Abilene?
We went down to Abilene and let's see, we stayed at Camp Campbell, I think, all through 43. We went down to Abilene in 44, I think.
What do you remember about the trip? How did they get y'all down there? Was that a big hassle, or did that go pretty smoothly?
No, the transportation went very smooth. It was very well organized, and there were a lot of glitches here, there, and but once you got started, went by train, and we left most of our heavy equipment at Camp Campbell, and we were given some not new but some old used equipment in Camp Barkley. And I remember when we got to Camp Barkley that the M7s as well as the M4 tanks that were being used at that time were practically all had the radial engine in it. It was the old Wright Whirlwind airplane engine, which was somewhat dated at that time, but it would develop 400 or 500 horsepower, something like that, 400 I guess it was. And it was adequate. That's about all you could say for it. It was adequate for the tanks. The tanks just kept getting heavier with more armament, so forth, and there was not a purpose-built tank engine available at that time, not an engine built for the tanks. And it was pretty hard to get airplane engines. They were made by companies. I think Continental made most of the Wright Whirlwind engines that we used, but the M7s were some 22 tons, I believe. The M4s of that time weighed around 30 tons, 32 tons, something like that. They decided that the M7s, being lighter in weight, could use an engine that was a little less powerful. So they took the engines that they had out in Camp Barkley had cast iron pistons in them. And that decreased the performance quite a bit. And I know we couldn't keep up with the tanks. We had trouble because we had these engines that just didn't work well. And of course they were used for training only at that time. And we left all of those out at Camp Barkley for some other unit to use in training. I don't know what they did with them. But when we went overseas, we were given tanks with the Ford engines. And the Ford had built an engine that was a V8, naturally for Ford, but it actually was 2/3 of an airplane engine. The Ford Company and General Motors, through their Allison division, had competed to furnish the engine for the P-40s, the water-cooled engines. Ford lost out, but they took the basic design, cut 4 cylinders off, and made an excellent tank engine out of it. The Ford tank engine was just like cranking up an automobile and running it. You paid about as much attention to the engine as you would to an engine in a car. But most of the tanks that were used over in Europe used the Ford engine, and that was the M4A3 model for the tank. And the M7s we had were M7B. The M7B indicated that they had the Ford engine in them. But essentially it was about the same vehicle that we used in Camp Barkley.
You mentioned the M7B. What was like the range of your artillery piece?
7 miles.
7 miles. And how fast could you fire that?
Oh, it was slower than the French 75, but a good crew could fire it fairly rapidly. The big question was not in firing so rapidly, there was never enough ammunition. We were always, in my memory out there, rationed on the amount of ammunition that we could use. And we seldom got into a situation where you would have a set piece battle like General Montgomery of the British Army like to get everything lined up and get all the ammunition in the world and you know, just shoot as fast as you could and just blast a big hole in the line, something like that. But there was always a shortage of ammunition, and you had to really justify a target before you could shoot on it. So the rapidity of the fire was not as essential as the accuracy.
You mentioned that the ammunition was rationed. Did y'all also have any problem with food or water or anything else?
No, we had no problem with any of the ammunition except the artillery ammunition, small arms, 50, 30 caliber, and that sort of thing. There was no problem with that.
You mentioned that the M7 was lighter than the M4, the tank. Was that because the armor was different?
Armor was different. The side armor and the top armor and the turret had been stripped off, and they had, I think, a half-inch armor, sort of a box around it. But they did have a lot of excess weight just due to the fact that it was a production expedient in that they could take, in the first case, they took the M3 tank, and then they simply took the artillery piece that had been developed for towed artillery behind a truck, and they cut some of the pieces off and welded the thing into the front of the M7, and they did it very quickly, and it was admittedly just an expedient. They came out later with a 105 millimeter tank that had 360-degree traverse. You were limited in your traverse with the M7 to, maybe little figures in the book, but it was very narrow. You could go about maybe 22 degrees in one direction, 22 in another, without moving the tank. So when you were firing the M7, generally you had the tank engine cranked up and running so that the driver could shift the whole tank around to get it pointed in the right direction. But it worked, and it worked well, but had they had time to do it, they would have done it differently.
How large of a bullet would that armor that was on y'all's M7 stop? How much protection did it give y'all?
It stopped a 50 caliber machine gun. After that, maybe it would stop a 20 millimeter projectile. But the biggest problem was the top was open. The same thing was true with the half-track. The half-track, it served well, but the Army wanted something else, and since World War II, they converted over to covered vehicles that could protect you from shell fragments coming in from the top. But we had a half-inch armor, and unless, I don't know, you could take something like a 50 caliber, maybe if you were at point blank range it would penetrate, but we felt that it was safe against 50 caliber. But it certainly was not designed to fight like a tank. It was designed to fight the same as you used any other artillery, and it had an added degree of protection. You could duck down behind the armor if somebody was shooting at you from the side.
What were you still a second lieutenant when you got over there to France?
No, the procedure was to everything was gradually expanding. A lot of the people that came into the 12th Armored Division originally, they went on somewhere else, and it was typical. Say the second lieutenants that came in would, within about 6 months, to make first lieutenant, and a large number of us made first lieutenant and then captain. All of the firing battery commanders, there were 3 firing batteries in the battalion, battery A, B, and C. And all of the battery commanders, which carried the nominal rank of captain, were from that group that came in from OCS. So I was the battery commander of Battery A, and I had been commissioned as a captain at that time.
Do you remember anything different about Camp Campbell versus Camp Barclay down at Abilene, other than you were still doing training? Was the training different, or why did they bring y'all down there to do more training?
That's a good question. One never really knows what the reason is, but they probably had other uses for Camp Campbell, and I think the main reason, though, was just to give a different type of terrain to operate on. And we could do things down at Camp Barclay you couldn't do at Camp Campbell, for instance. And it, I think, was probably cheaper to have troops stationed at Camp Barclay than at Camp Campbell.
What things could you do at Barclay that you couldn't do at Campbell?
Well, we had more open space to maneuver in. And at one time there was a feeling that the armored divisions should have more training in desert areas, or areas like North Africa, for instance, and the dry climate down there, and the fact that you had open terrain, most generally speaking, whereas in Camp Campbell you were in heavily wooded patched small farmer areas. They had there were mostly tobacco farms around there, and you had more trees and things, but it gave you a different look at the different types of terrain that you might be fighting over in the future.
Did y'all ever get liberty or passes to go into Abilene?
Oh yes, there was no problem to get a pass to go into Abilene as a general rule. Matter of fact, many of the officers lived off post there and lived in Abilene.
Even the single officers? Or just the ones that were married?
I think you had to be married to get permission to live off the post. I never wanted to live off the post myself because it was expensive. They furnished your room and board while you lived there on the camp, and I think the officers that lived off post did get an allowance for food. They lived off the post, but I think all of the single officers lived in camp.
What you said, it was easy to get a pass. Was that because you were an officer? Was it also
No,
easy
it
for
was
the
easy
enlisted men?
for-
It was just
There were certain restrictions. Of course, some people were restricted to quarters for disciplinary action, and you had to keep certain amount of the troops in, but there was really no problem with that. it was adequate. If you were out on maneuvers or out on a field trip, maybe a week or so, of course, everybody was out in the field. But when you were back in camp, there was no problem getting passes into Abilene.
Being an officer, what were your feelings and the aspects on the way that the change of command was done right before they shipped y'all out with the division commander?
Well, General Brewer was he was pretty well liked. He had been chewed out a number of times, but I deserved it, and I remember several. But things somehow or another didn't gel. I don't know. I think the general opinion was that General Brewer got crosswise with someone higher up in command, and you know, they get it in for you in the Army, and there's nothing you can do. But anyway, he had some problems. Of course, he was like all of the rest of us. No one had really done that job before. You know, they were operating at a level above which they had had training for. But we had some problems with passing the test. There's a standardized test that a division has to pass before it's considered ready for combat. Of course, there's exceptions, but that was the rule then, that you had to do that. And some of the things went wrong that they felt that were his fault, and we had to do them over again. And that was a pretty rough time there on a number of people, because everybody was, once you were in that position where you had, let's just say, well, you failed the original test, you go in for the next test, everybody is looking at you very carefully. I know we didn't have a whole lot of trouble with it in the artillery. Always can pick out some faults, you know. You got a checklist there, you did this, you did that sort of thing, and somebody's up there making those comments that may not know as much about the situation as those who are actually doing them. Anyway, one of the tests that we had to pass when before we went overseas was to fire live ammunition over the heads of troops and to advance under a rolling barrage. This was the sort of thing that would be done, say, in a set-piece battle where you had all the infantry lined up ready to jump off, and you would fire over their heads, and not at a specific target, but you were keeping the fire 100, 200 yards out in front of the infantry. You didn't have much safety factor in that. Each little thing goes wrong, you could drop around back, you know, on your own troops. Well, we got out to do that, and we were supporting one of the infantry battalions as our normal organization. They had it divided into combat commands, and we supported, I think, it was the 56th Infantry Battalion. And during their advance, in front of this rolling barrage, you'd fire, and then you'd increase the range just to keep ahead of the troops that were advancing. We fired for the my battery fired for the 56th. They normally you would have in combat you would have the whole battalion firing, but for just the training of the infantry troops to get them accustomed to the shells going over their head and dropping out in front of them, they used only a battery. Well, that was one of the days that that I remember quite well, because you didn't have the safety precautions set up that you would have in normal service practice, and those were where you had time to look at each gun before it fired, and you could get some idea of what was going on. But you had to, you didn't have any of these safety precautions, but they made the battery commander the safety officer. There always has to be someone to take the blame if something happens. And and I was a safety officer for my own battery, which really should not have been, but we fired, to make a long story short, we fired and everything went perfect. The rolling barrage just went right out ahead, and everybody was so happy with the fact that we'd done something right in this retest that they said, well, this is an exercise for the infantry. Said, you got a battery of field artillery out there that is accustomed to what they're going to do. Let's just leave them in a place. And they ran the whole, had to fire over the whole division. And each time I'd sweat it out, you know, that, but after a while, that got to the point where that's what, you know, that's what you do all the time in combat. But I do remember those were rather, they were pretty hard days to sit there and sweat that out. And I was very glad when that whole exercise was over. But we not only lost Colonel Brewer, as you know, General Brewer, but there was another general. You may have his name.
General Allen?
Not Allen, before him. Seemed like his name was Williams. I'm not sure. But he succeeded Brewer. And he went to New York with us. And in New York, they detected a heart murmur or something. And Brewer, they decided not to ship him overseas. And they had General Allen, who was a fair-haired boy over in Europe at that time, that was just ripe to get a division. So they assigned the division to General Allen. And we went over without a division commander. And on the way over, our battalion was on the Tasco H. Bliss, which was Navy transport. It was a fairly new type of transport. It could travel in what they call fast convoys. We were doing about 16 knots, I think. And the commodore of the fleet of that convoy was a Captain Weems, who was more of a technical officer, and he was one of the noted navigational officers. He had developed a system of navigating by the moon, but he was quite an old officer at the time, and but he was given the rank as Commodore, although he was still a captain. And his aide was Wendell Willkie's son. I don't know whether you remember Wendell Willkie, a presidential candidate against Roosevelt.
No, sir, it was before my time.
Yeah, I know it was before your time. Philip Willkie, he later was a judge in Wisconsin. But it was a nice trip over there. The water was just like a mill pond, as I recall, and we had to get out and sunbathe, and we took the southern route, and we were headed for, what's the name of, Cherbourg. Cherbourg was so heavily infested with mines that they didn't get them cleared out in time. And we got about 2/3 of the way across the ocean. We had to hang a left and go to England. Well, everything was organized back in those days, and they didn't have it organized for the 12th Armored Division to come into England. So they had to make some makeshift arrangements. And we went in, I guess it was the Bristol Channel and up a little port called Avonmouth, mouth of the Avon River. And we were taken, the battalion, all of us in the battalion, I think the entire battalion was on the Tasco H. Bliss. There may have been some other units on there, but all I can remember is our battalion were taken by truck to an Air Force, to an airport where they had, it was a transport, C-47 squadron there, maybe two, I don't know how many. There were a lot of C-47s around. And they took us and put us in one big hangar, all 500 people, side by side almost, in this hangar to get out of the weather. And that was a luxury to get out of the weather in those days, when if you didn't have any place to stay. But anyway, it kept us dry, and they had facilities there to take care of transient troops. And what they would do was they would bring in the paratroopers and stage them through this airport, and the people there at the airport thought we were just another bunch of paratroopers they were going to drop somewhere. So they put us in there, and you went through the long lines. You know, you feed 500 people, and it takes some time to get all of that done, just the housekeeping and Army. It takes a lot of time to do, but we were stationed at the airport. Well, what next? And everybody was standing around scratching their heads, where do we go from here? Well, in the meantime, General Allen had been informed that he was commanding general of the division. And he went to Cherbourg, and nobody showed up. And he started making some inquiries, and they said, well, it may be in England somewhere. They did give him as I understand, they gave him a C-47 to go around and try to find his division. Well, they had scattered that convoy all across the west coast of England, every place that a ship could get in. It one or two here and one or two there. Everything was scattered all over the place. And he started looking for his division, and he landed at the airport where we were. And he walked, we saw a couple of people there, some of the boys in the division. They were walking around, and he walked over toward them and asked them who they were. They gave him his name, rank, and serial number or something like that. We were forbidden to even mention any unit. And he asked them, well, have you seen anybody from the 12th Armored Division? And they hemmed and hawed a little bit and said, maybe we better take you to Colonel Crawford, and who was our commanding officer. And Colonel Crawford had known General Allen before, both being regular Army. So that was the first contact General Allen had with the division, was when he found the 494th in an airplane hangar somewhere in the Midlands of England.
So when y'all stayed there to England, and then from there y'all went on to France?
Yes, there was. We had to find all of our equipment. See, we were one of the first divisions that was to go directly from the United States combat loaded. The only thing we didn't have, as I recall, was the tanks and the M7s, because they had shipped all of the M7s with the M4A3 tanks over to England, and we had to pick those up, round all of those up. But we had our half-tracks, and all of the other vehicles had been shipped over there, and we were supposed to go over there, pick up the tanks in France, and then go directly into the front lines from Cherbourg. Well, it took some time to assemble a division and make other plans. And they brought found some of the armor or the tanks over in Europe. And anyway, we got everything together, and we went in through Le Havre, the port of Le Havre, on landing ship tanks. And they assembled a division and got everybody together, and then we headed off. Seemed like we never knew where we were going to wind up when we started out on a trip. We started out to go to the Ninth Army, which was up in the northern Belgium, up in that area. Close to, it was the Ninth Army, I think, was adjacent to the British Army. At one time, the Ninth Army was a part of the British Army, or was under Montgomery. But anyway, we headed out there, and then they said, no, got about halfway there, you're going down to the Seventh Army. So we hung a right to it, went down into Alsace-Lorraine. I never have yet learned how to pronounce Alsace properly. Every time I look it up in a dictionary, I find three different versions, one English, one French, and one German. But we went into action down in the Seventh Army, under the Seventh Army.
Once you got to the 7th Army, so y'all were the 12th Armored Division assigned to 7th Army.
Assigned to the 7th Army.
And where did they have y'all go first, and what did they have y'all do first?
Well, I don't know. It's kind of hard to remember. My memory is that at that time, the 7th Army was advancing slowly, maybe 5 or 7 miles a day, usually from one village to the next village. As the infantrymen put it, from one set of wine cellars to the next set of wine cellars. And we didn't do a lot of heavy fighting. It was mostly rear guard action. And most of the time, the artillery was in support of other infantry units. The artillery was seldom pulled out of the line. The casualties in artillery were very light, comparatively speaking. I think we probably lost 9 people killed in the battalion, something like that, 9 or 10, give or take a few. But they would put you in position to support the infantry, and you could be attached. They would have organic artillery for a division, like the 44th Division, I believe, was one of the divisions, and they would have their artillery that was assigned to the 44th, and we would just simply attach ourselves to one of their battalions, but we always had to have the observers and forward observers out, and we supported the infantry divisions from time to time, and then moved back over and support the tanks. And then when the trouble started up in the Ardennes, there was a shifting around, and as I recall, we went over and were next to the 3rd Army, and they put the 12th Armored Division in the gap between the two armies to they tried to keep a continuous front. They never really ever attained a continuous front, but they tried to keep one. But we were in the gap between the 3rd Army and the 7th Army. I remember one night I got out and was going somewhere, and I ran into an infantryman, and all I could see, flash of light from a shell every now and then, was the muzzle of an M1 rifle pointing in my belly. And I had a carbine. At that time, all of the artillery officers were issued carbines. And the carbine was really a fast draw weapon if you carried it slung over your shoulder with the muzzle down. You could do that, and quicker than a man could draw a 45 out of a holster by far. But here we were, face to face, and we had, you had a password and then a response. I've forgotten now the exact procedure, but each unit would have the password, and here he was with a gun pointing at my belly, and I had mine pointing at his. He had the password for the 3rd Army, and I had the password for the 7th Army. So I remember that very distinctly. You know, it was a Mexican standoff there for a moment, and then common sense took over, and both of us recognized that the other was an American. That's one time when a good Southern accent was very useful. But after that, we fooling around, and not fooling around, but it was deadly business there. I can recall going out and going through a right after an attack had taken place in the morning. You'd go through where they had jumped off, and you could see where people had been wounded, and some of the bandages had been opened up and bloody spots. And I was out by myself one day, and I came across a corpse out there. You could tell the guy had probably gone only about 10 or 15 feet from the foxhole before a machine gun or something had caught him, killed him. And he was dressed just like a dummy or a model that would be photographed for how military uniform and equipment should be worn. Just as neat and prim, clean shaven, everything. And I said, he doesn't look like a regular soldier. And the fact that he was, fact that he looked so nice at the time, I thought it was. I remembered it was somewhat unusual. That has a bearing on something I may tell you a little in a few minutes if we've got time. But anyway, we were going to back up. Patton was supposed to clear out the land east of the Rhine, west of the Rhine, I guess it is, or west and south. He was supposed to clear that out by going northward. He later did it when they cleared out coming in from and swung around in the other direction. I wasn't with the 12th Armored when that happened, but that was one of the times when we would get ready for a set piece battle. And I went out and trying to find standing ground during the winter, the rainy season like that, that your vehicles could, the battery could stand on without getting mired down in the mud was a problem. I had first choice. We were backing up another infantry division that had been selected to go through the Siegfried line. And I went in and put a normal battery position in there. First thing I knew, some 155 long toms, very loud guns, long-range guns came in, and they were in part of my battery position. Then I looked out, and there was some 4.2 mortars right up in front of them, and then somebody was squeezing me in from the side. That was the only dry standing ground in that area, and they squeezed all the artillery in there. And after we got set to start, that's when the Battle of the Bulge broke, and they canceled that operation and pulled the troops out, and we went back down to another section of the front, and that's where I got wounded and left the war. I can tell you some more about that, but could you shut that off?
Hey, Tom, if you don't mind, we can leave that on.
Okay.
And then you can go ahead.
I wanted to use your bathroom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, sure. Okay.
77 years old, you know, this morning, and I ordered a pot of coffee. And
okay, Tom, you were talking about when you had gotten wounded. Where was that at?
Well, just to give some background information, the artillery units were organized more or less like they were organized in World War I. And the the battery itself was the basic firing unit in the division. One of the strong points of the American Army was the way they handled the artillery. I think most of the reviews you see of the Army were complimentary the way the American artillery worked. And that was due primarily to the fire control and the ability to concentrate the fire of many units all in on one target with a lot of speed. And to do that, the battalion was operated more or less as a battery had been operated in the old days. So we had 18 guns in our battalion, whereas a normal battalion would have 12 guns, but the armored artillery had 6 guns per battery, making 18 for the battalion. That battalion operated more or less as a unit, and all you needed at the firing position was one officer, normally the executive officer, took care of all of the directions for the firing to be done. Then you had the housekeeping chores like getting the kitchen truck, and incidentally, the kitchen truck was very important. In selecting positions, I always look for a place to put the kitchen truck first. But that is very important. And then the perimeter defense. Well, the first sergeant could take care of that, and you only needed one officer at a battery. And that left 3 other officers available to do forward observer work, liaison work, and surveying work, or do other work that normally that wasn't the job. The job description didn't cover that, but that's the way it worked, and it worked very nicely. For instance, Baker Battery had an officer that had eagle eyes, and he was the best forward observer from air observer that we had. And he spent most of his time in the Cubs, in addition to being battery commander, Captain David Hill. And we did different jobs like that, and my specialty was in selecting firing positions. Of course, the colonel would indicate where to go with general area, but then you had to sort that out where you could put a battery here, a battery here, a battery here, and you had various requirements for where you sited a battery. Of course, you couldn't put it right up behind buildings or trees. You had to get back to where you could have a fair range of fire. The 105 millimeter was best suited for that sort of work because you had 7 different charges. You could fire it with just a poof, or you could fire it with a big crack with charge 7. So when you had the opportunity to get into a position where you had something out in front of you, and you could fire over like this, or in long distances you could fire out like that. But you had to take all of that into account when you selected your position, and there was no perfect position. You made do with the best you could find. So as we were advancing along, every morning, as soon as the advance would take off of the infantry, we would push in right behind, getting a battery position ready to move. And we'd not only go forward, but we would go laterally and to the rear. Always have a battery position. You never knew what would happen. If you had to retreat, you knew you could go back here and you'd have one picked out. So we may have had an overkill on selecting the battery positions, but we did go out and get those positions selected, and that I went with the battalion reconnaissance officer, and we usually work together on those things and select for the whole battalion rather than for just my battery alone. But we would were advancing that morning, and this was after the Bulge had broken, the Battle of the Bulge had broken. And we went into some rather rugged terrain. There was a ridge going perpendicular to the direction of the enemy on one side and one on the other, and then there were some valleys and other deep ravines in between, and we were getting out of the flatlands, more or less. I guess it was part of the Vosges Mountains back in that area, foothills. And we were in a little valley there, and I had gone back up there to take one last look. It was one of these places where you made do with what you had. And there was some firing going on, and there was some artillery around and about, but nothing in our area. And I was walking along there thinking mostly about how the battery positions would be located, could be located. And I heard a shell. And at that time I thought I was very good at detecting whether the shell was going over or falling short or coming in. And the Doppler effect on the sound that the shells make going through the air, like a train coming, you know, and you get to learn those things. And I listened to that one, and apparently I was down in the valley, and the sound was distorted, and the sound of that shell changed, and I knew it was almost on top of me. And of course the reflex is to hit the ground immediately, and no sooner had I flexed my knees and shell hit right behind me. It looked like, later on some other guys said it was about 10 or 15 feet behind me. And I never heard the crack of the shell. Normally you hear it, but it was so close, all I heard was, or remember hearing, was the sound of the wind. And my back felt like shell fragments were going all through it. And something hit my leg and knocked it out from under me, like a sled, just like a sledgehammer had hit the leg. And I guess I fell forward a little bit, and I was all alone at the time, and we had been trained to put a tourniquet on the limb if you had a wound. And the carbine we carried had a canvas strap that that had a small pin that was oil, contained oil in the gun, but it fit in the stock, and that's what attached the carrying strap for the rifle to the stock. And ordinarily it was a very simple task just to pull that pin out, take the strap out. I'd done it 100 times before, but I was in such a hurry I could not get that strap loose, and I was bleeding all through the leg here and blood running everywhere. And I decided I'd put that strap on there. Then I said, no, I'm not going to get this strap off in time. I better grab this pressure point. I'd grab that pressure point and hold it, and I said, well, I can't hold this pressure point that long. I'd start back with the strap again. And by that time I had realized that the wounds in my back were not really wounds. And I've been told that you can get a very sharp blow on the body that affects a lot of the nerve cells. It really hurts more than a penetrating wound. And what had happened was this shell was hit right behind me, and it penetrated into the ground enough to kick gravel and dirt up, and it hit my back. And the piece that hit my leg was probably the nose spray from the shell. And when a shell explodes, it's coming in this direction, the effect from the shell is out to the side like this, and you get a small amount of fragments of the shell that go forward. And apparently one of those hit the side of my leg. and I don't know, another one hit the right foot. So the right foot was just it hurt, but this was a wound over here that was hurting the worst, and one that I was trying to stem the flow of blood. And by that time, Lieutenant Weston, who was with me, came running up the hill. He had seen me at the top of the hill and thought I was still on the hill. And it was just that one shell that came in. I guess there were some tanks up ahead of us, and that was probably a ranging round that they were firing, and it was an over about 400 yards or 500 yards over his first shell, and then the rest of them were back over, because only one shell came in, which was rather unusual. They weren't shooting at me, they were just shooting. But anyway, he came running up the hill. He'd seen me at the top of the hill, and I was calling out to him as loud as I could. I don't know whether I was making any noise or not, but I was trying. He ran right by me and ran up about 25 feet from me before he stopped. And it was a steep hill, and you know, he was winded running up that hill. And he stopped, he heard me, and he got over there and he helped me get the tourniquet on, and called in some other people. And I had my Jeep down there and the Jeep driver with me. And somewhere a medic appeared. He had beard, long, unshaven, but he looked like an angel to me. He gave me a shot of morphine, and they tried to take me back. They offered to take me back in one of the light tanks that were down there, putting it across the back. I didn't want any part of a tank. Tanks just draw fire. And they got the stretcher from somewhere and put it across the Jeep. We started back, and we were going down one hill on the attack, and the Germans were going down the other ridge. And as we went back, they started firing over the ridge at us, and we had to, driver had to, Hal Reeser was his name, he had to duck over the other side. There were a couple of people holding us on the Jeep, and we got over on the other side of the ridge, and there was no problem. I went back to the battalion aid station, and says, battalion aid officer said, "Well, you're the first officer we've had in here." I said, "That's supposed to make me feel good." And he said, "Well, we haven't had much business back here since the war. Might as well break out the medicinal whiskey." They poured a water glass full of whiskey. I think it was a water glass. But I drank it, and that was the morphine. I wasn't feeling too badly. So he said, "Well, got to get you out of here." They wrapped some bandages around it and sent me back to division. You go through chain of command all the way back. Went back to division. I knew the medical officer back there, and he says, "Hello, Tom. Well, guess better give you a drink of whiskey." They gave me another drink of whiskey. Had I known that, I might have shot myself before. Anyway, they said, "We can't do anything for you here. You're going to have to go back to a unit." I guess it was similar to a MASH unit. So they took me back to the building, and on the way back, it was nightfall by that time that they got me back there, and German plane came over while I was in the ambulance. There were 4 of us in the ambulance. Started strafing the road we were on. And the 4 of us were in there. The driver and the assistant driver, they just parked the ambulance on the side of the road and went down in the basement. And I guess it's a good thing they didn't hear what we called them for running off and leaving us. But you know, one of the feelings you have when something like that happens, they take your gun away from you. You feel absolutely naked and defenseless when your gun is gone. I went back to this hospital, and this was just before Christmas, and I was in this hospital on Christmas. one of the memorable occasions was the French came in. It was a nicer building than just a tent or anything, but they had a lot of people in the hospital. And some little French girls came in, and they had made, taken an apple and put sticks in it and hats on it, and made a little apple dressed up for Christmas gifts. But then the question then of getting on back, which is another longer story, tell some other time, but we did go back to a general hospital in Dijon, France, which had not been touched by the war. They took us back on a railroad train, and the car they had was an old French passenger car, fairly large car for a European railroad that had been burned out, been strafed by Allied planes and been set on fire, burned out. It had been refurbished. They just painted the inside of it white. All of the insulation was gone, but it had a roof over it, which was something to be thankful for back at that time. And they had along the side of the stretchers, along the side, they were either 2 or 3 deep, I don't know how deep, but they had quite a few people in that one car. And most of them were in worse shape than I was. And I tried to help some of them, but I couldn't move around and do anything. But there was a person on that train that I thought very much of. Do you remember Madeleine Carroll, the movie actress?
I know of her, sir.
She's was one of the top draw attractions in Hollywood. She was a Red Cross worker, and she chose to work on those trains. She could have had a plush job back at any headquarters in Europe she'd wanted to go to, you know. Everybody would have liked to have shown her off. This is Madeleine Carroll here as part of our headquarters here, but she could have worked anywhere she wanted to go. But she chose to work on that train, and she, I think, did that most of the war. And she was very, very helpful, you know, coming through the train and talking to the people. But then there was a story of going over in England and recuperating for 3 months, which was an interesting story to me anyway in itself, but it takes too long in telling. Anyway, I got back to the battalion the day the war was over. 3-4 months in the hospital.
Were you married
No.
after the war, or you were single this whole time?
I was single.
Did you get letters from your family and such while you were over there and writing back to them, or did you have time for it? Or
Yes. We had our APO number was 251, as I recall, and everything was written to APO 251, and then the Army took over from there and distributed all of the mail. But mail was not too bad. I wrote my mother, and you could get, they had V-mail, which you could write a letter, they would photostat it and reduce it, and could send many of them back. They sent those back airmail, I believe. So you could get communications going back and forth fairly rapidly. And just recently I had gone through some of the things my mother had after she died, and I found all of the letters that I had written her during the time that I was overseas. None of which were literary masterpieces. Hello, how are you? Can't tell you where I am and that sort of thing. But there was quite a bunch of them that still exist.
is there anything else that you remember you want to tell us, or anything that sticks out in your mind?
When you get a 77-year-old man in a room and ask him to tell you things, you're asking for it. I may have overstayed my welcome as it is.
Can I ask you, what do you remember from the last day of the war? Like, what people do you remember, faces, expressions? What went through your head?
Well, it didn't happen all at once. It was something that gradually came on in degrees. There were rumors. And you knew it was over, but no one had said that it was over. Just wonder if I have something here that... the last day of the war, as I recall, I got back to the outfit the day the war ended. They asked me where I'd been. I said, well, there's been a war on up here. I was back where it was safe. But I remember the night before, there was an inordinate amount of shooting going off, and mostly from quartermaster troops that had 50 caliber machine guns in the 6x6 trucks. Probably had never fired at anybody in their life, and they wanted to. And you know, with 50 caliber machine gun bullets going all over the sky, I just got down in the basement and stayed there till it was over, because you didn't know which. You know, everybody was drinking. It was almost like some of these pictures you see of these Arabs shooting. You know, you've seen those on television, but. It's a stupid thing. I'm sure a number of people got killed from that. But when I got back to the battery, they had already set up housekeeping in a little town, New Offingen, Germany. And I got back there, and that was the day that the war was officially announced as being over. And the little town still had town criers. And it wasn't official until the guy, the town crier, went down through the village and rang his bell. And I can remember what he said: "Der Krieg für Tisch, alles kaputt. Der Krieg für Tisch, alles kaputt."
How long did you stay over in Germany in occupation duty?
I stayed over there until I stayed over there a year nearly.
How do you feel like the German people received, the German civilians, were they friendly or hostile towards American troops during the occupation? Was there a good relationship, or was
There
that
was a
bad?
very, very good relationship. I felt more at home in Germany, really, than I felt in any other country. They seemed to think more like we did in many respects. And in the village that I was in, you could go out there and you'd get to see people as individuals. And there's old man Claude Newton. You'd have the same town characters in the villages that we had. And I came from a small town, but once the Germans quit fighting, there was no trouble whatsoever in the areas that I was in. And it was all somebody else's fault, naturally, but I talked to a number of them over there, and one of the people, a very responsible person, he said he had owned a small manufacturing plant. And he said it's something that it's hard to tell because no one would believe how it's happened. I can hardly believe it myself. Said we had a choice to make in Germany after the Depression. When Hitler came into power, it was said it was either Hitler or the communist. We had to go one way or the other. And we went with Hitler. And he had the charisma about him that he could charm the whole nation, and he got things going and got things organized and going right. and he set the whole country straight. No question, he did a good job. Very ruthlessly, but he did a good job. And he said everybody was very pleased with what he was doing. They said they knew he was taking a few shortcuts, but they didn't realize the extent to which he was going, especially what happened with the Jews. And he said once they realized it was too late to turn back. And he said they didn't want to believe the stories about the concentration camps, and they had heard these things, but they just put them out of the mind, and said it was a very difficult time to live if you followed the Nazi line of thinking and didn't, get out of line. Everything was fine. But if you tried to do some independent thinking of your own, it was almost impossible. He said he knows it shouldn't have been that way, but he said that's the way it was, that they couldn't, I think to a certain extent. He said they had heard what was going on, but they didn't know. They didn't want to know. And when the war was over, they took a number of the leading citizens of each town, just says, you come here, then there was no choice, the American troops, and took them to the concentration camps. There was one that the 12th Armored Division had helped liberate that they took this man to, and he said he just couldn't believe it, that what he saw was even worse than what he had feared. But that's the kind of story you get from them, but they were, I think, very, very, very helpful during the occupation. The occupation was nothing. We had feared that there was this story that the Germans concocted. I guess it was Goebbels that did it, the propaganda minister, that they were organizing a national redoubt area down in the Bavarian Alps. There's nothing to that, but the Army swallowed that line, swallowed that story, hook, line, and sinker. And they were afraid that there were caches of ammunition secreted in the Bavarian Alps, and they were all coming back down there. Around Munich, that was the birthplace of the Nazi Party, that they were coming back down there and fight a protracted guerrilla war. And guerrilla war is one of the worst types of wars. It escalates very quickly. That when you start anything like that, both sides commit atrocities, and nobody wanted to get in that situation. It just didn't exist. It was a myth, but the Army refused to believe that it wasn't a myth, I think, for months after the war was over. But there's one thing that sticks in my mind, is that there was a non-fraternization policy with the Germans after the war was over. Your dealings with them had to be strictly military business, or the business of the occupation. And that way, if both the soldiers and the civilians, they seemed to be on the same side. They were conspiring against the Army, and you tell somebody something is forbidden, that just makes them want to do it that much more. But it worked out very well, I think, and I think it was the proper policy, although at times one would have wanted to have been a little, right the year after the war was, one would have wanted to have been a little more neighborly is not the word, but friendly, I guess, is with the people over there. And to a certain extent, many of them were victims of Nazism, the same as the other people of France, other people of the world. Not as bad, but they too had been used very severely by the Hitler government. But I liked it while I was over there, and unfortunately, I missed out. The reason I didn't come back earlier, I missed out. There were 2 or 3 battle stars while I was in the hospital that I would have gotten 5 points for toward coming home. And I lacked 5 points of being able to come home immediately. And my goal was to go to school when I got out. So I stayed over there another year and saved my money and then came back home. Interesting footnote to the 12th Armored Division may be that many of them, I'd say almost most of them, were transferred over to those that were not eligible to come home were transferred over to the 1st Armored Division. Matter of fact, I went over to the 1st Armored Division about 3 months after the war was over. And it was Battery A, 68th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. And we still had the same weapons we had in, still had the same weapons we had in 494th. Same guns we used all along, and a lot of the troops from A Battery were still there. And one of the people thought, well, it was a waste of time, that all they should have done, rather than transferring the people, they just should have had them throw a number 1 1st Armored Division patch on the shoulders, but that isn't the way the Army does things. But we still were in an Armored Division, but I think the day after the war was ended over there, we would have been hard put to have ever fought a battle again. There was no military training other than Army of Occupation. Just have a man there with a gun was all that was needed. But if anything any war had ever broke out, we couldn't have shot our way out of a paper bag.
Do you guys have any other questions?
No.
That's it, Tom. We sure do appreciate it.
Well,
And
I
we'd-
don't say
honestly, if